All right, so today we are diving into the world of Confucius. You've probably seen the memes, maybe you had a few too many fortune cookies, but we are here to cut through all of that and get to the heart of his life and teachings. What made this guy tick, and why should we still care about what he had to say thousands of years later?
Well, it's funny you should mention memes and fortune cookies, because Confucius actually lived in a time that was anything but peaceful and straightforward. Imagine China in the 6th century BCE.
Okay, painting a picture here. What was going on?
Think powerful families all vying for control, political intrigue, constant upheaval.
Oh, wow. So like a real-life Game of Thrones situation.
Exactly. Not exactly a serene environment for quiet contemplation, right? And yet this chaotic period is where we find Confucius, or Kong Q as he was originally known, trying to make sense of it all.
So our sources say this was a time of, quote, rich diversity of thought. It's not like he was alone in trying to figure out the best way to live and govern.
Absolutely. This era, around the 6th century BCE, was really a boiling pot of ideas, which makes it all the more fascinating. And it was during this time that Confucius was born, around 551 BCE. He actually lived a pretty long life for the time, passing away around 479 BCE.
Okay, and those dates are important because we're talking about someone whose ideas are still studied and debated by over 1 billion people. Not bad for a guy who came from relatively humble beginnings.
Right, and it's not just China. His influence spread throughout Asia, impacting Korea, Japan, Vietnam. Even today, his ideas about morality and leadership really haven't lost their relevance.
Well, speaking of relevance, I think it's time we address the elephant in the room, or should I say, the fortune cookie in the takeout bag. Because I have a feeling Confucius wasn't exactly handing out cryptic life advice with dessert.
You're telling me.
So let's get real. What did he actually teach?
Okay, so you're right. The fortune cookie version of Confucius, that's definitely reductive, to say the least. He often gets boiled down to these rigid rules or simplistic sayings, which really misses the mark.
Okay, so if it wasn't about following a strict set of do's and don'ts, what was it about?
It was all about building good character. This wasn't about blind obedience. It was about people developing the judgment to make ethical choices no matter what situation they found themselves in.
So he was pushing for ethical behavior, but wasn't that already a thing back then? I mean, what made his approach so radical?
It was radical because it wasn't about appeasing the gods or avoiding punishment in the afterlife. This was about cultivating your inner moral compass. There's this great anecdote about Confucius. He returns home and finds his stable on fire. And you know what his first question is. It wasn't about the horses. It wasn't about the property. It was anyone hurt?
Oh, wow. That's actually a really powerful example. I mean, it really shows that he valued human life above all else.
Exactly. His focus was always on the human impact of actions. He believed in things like compassion, empathy, really understanding the deeper why behind moral principles.
So it sounds like he was trying to create this ripple effect. It starts with individual moral development, and then eventually that transforms society from the ground up. Even the government, right?
You've hit the nail on the head. Confucius truly believed that a society full of ethical, well-rounded individuals that would naturally lead to a more just and harmonious government.
That's a pretty ambitious goal, even by today's standards. But if everyone is so focused on being their best selves, does that mean the government just runs itself? Was he advocating for some utopian society where there's no need for laws or rulers or anything?
Well, not quite a utopia. I mean, it's not like he thought laws and rulers were completely unnecessary. It's more complicated than that. He definitely had some strong ideas about government, but...
Okay, so he wasn't advocating for complete anarchy. What did he see as the role of government then, if not just punishing people all the time?
He believed that a ruler's most important job, their primary responsibility, wasn't about handing out punishments or even enforcing laws. It was about being a moral example.
A moral example. So almost like actions speak louder than words.
Yeah, exactly. Someone whose own behavior, their own conduct, would inspire people to strive for virtue themselves, to want to be better.
That's a pretty radical idea, especially for that time period. I mean, we were talking earlier about warlords and power struggles being the norm. This idea that you lead by inspiring people, not forcing them. Did anyone actually take him seriously?
You're right. I mean, it's quite a contrast, his ideals versus the reality of what was happening around him. And, there's actually this great story about Confucius. He was given a government position, but then he ended up resigning because he felt like the ruler, the guy he was serving, wasn't living up to those ideals, wasn't walking the walk.
No way. He walked away from a position of power because of that.
He did. He refused to compromise his principles, even if it meant giving up power and influence, which, says a lot about the guy.
It really does.
Yeah.
It makes you think, though, if his ideas seem so, I don't know, out of sync with what was happening at the time, how did he go from this teacher with, let's be honest, kind of a radical, different approach to basically the philosophical rock star of China?
Well, and that's the fascinating part. His rise to fame, it was mostly posthumous. So after Confucius dies, his disciples, those devoted students who learned directly from him, they took it upon themselves to spread his teachings.
They continued his work, kind of like carrying the torch.
Exactly. They traveled around, they preached, and importantly, they wrote everything down. They wanted to preserve his words, his ideas, everything. And that's how he got the Analects.
The Analects. Okay, so for anyone who hasn't had the pleasure of digging into this ancient text, what are we talking about here?
It's basically a compilation of his teachings, his conversations, all those little nuggets of wisdom he was known for.
So kind of like the ultimate class notes passed down through generations of students.
Exactly. And with something as, nuanced as philosophy, there are always going to be different interpretations. People are going to disagree on what he actually meant.
Oh, so there were like philosophical battles being waged, but all in the name of Confucius.
You could say that. It's actually pretty fascinating. And there were a couple of really big names, major players in this Confucian debate.
Okay, hit me with it. Who are we talking about?
Two names you really should know, Mencius and Zuni. Both incredibly influential Confucian scholars, but with distinct interpretations of his teachings.
So different schools of thought within Confucianism. What were their main points of contention?
Well, Mencius, he was writing in the 4th century BCE, so a bit after Confucius, and he really emphasized the inherent goodness of human nature.
So he was team people are born good.
Exactly. He argued that we are all born with this capacity for compassion, for morality, all those Confucian virtues we've been talking about.
Okay, so for Mencius, it was all about tapping into that inner goodness. What about Zuni? Was he like the opposite end of the spectrum?
Not entirely opposite, but definitely a counterpoint. Zuni came a bit later, and he took a more, I guess you could say, pragmatic view of human nature. He argued that we aren't born good, but rather that human nature is inherently selfish.
Oh, wow. Okay, so a bit more cynical.
In a way. But his point was that morality, all those virtues, they're not something we're born with, but rather something we learn.
Learn through things like education and experience.
Exactly. And through rituals and the right social structures, he believed these things were essential for shaping individuals and creating a harmonious society.
Okay, so Team Mencius is born good, and Team Zuni is more nurture over nature, which is so interesting because that debate about whether humans are inherently good or if morality is something that needs to be taught or learned, it's still something we're grappling with today.
Absolutely. It's a timeless question for sure.
But how did Confucianism go from these, philosophical sparring matches to actually shaping an entire empire? Because that's what's so wild about all of this.
Well, for centuries, a lot of those big Confucian ideas about morality, about education, leadership, those mostly stayed in the realm of theory. People were talking about it, debating it, but it wasn't really put into practice in a widespread way. And then things changed, big time, during the Han Dynasty.
Okay, so this is like a turning point for Confucianism. What happened? Did they suddenly find some lost scroll with all the answers on it?
Not quite a lost scroll, but close. This Emperor Wu of Han, he comes along and basically says, Confucianism, this is it. This is the official state philosophy. And get this, to get a government job, you had to pass an exam on Confucian classics. Can you imagine that?
Whoa, hold on. So to work for the government, you had to basically ace a philosophy exam. That's taking know your classics to a whole other level.
Right. Talk about making philosophy relevant to your everyday life. And that's how Confucianism really became ingrained in Chinese society, shaping everything from family dynamics to, like you said, the role of the emperor himself. But, we're talking about centuries here. Things change.
That's true. Empires rise and fall, ideas evolve. So what shifted? Did people start to think that maybe Confucius was a bit outdated?
Yeah, there were definitely some growing pains. You get to the 19th century, and China's facing all this pressure, both internally and from the outside world, to modernize. And some people started to feel like Confucianism, with its emphasis on tradition and respecting authority, that it was holding them back.
Interesting. So the very things that had made it so successful, those core values, now some people are seeing them as obstacles.
Exactly. It was a time of huge intellectual and political upheaval. Some people felt that China needed radical change, and they saw Confucianism as this symbol of the past, something that was keeping them stuck.
It's almost ironic in a way. Confucius, who, let's be honest, was considered a pretty radical thinker in his own time. Centuries later, he's associated with the status quo.
It's true. History has a funny way of, shifting perspectives.
It really does.
Yeah.
So what happened next? Did things settle down, or did Confucianism face even more challenges?
Buckle up, because the 20th century gets even more complicated. You have the rise of the Communist Party in China, and they saw Confucianism as representing that old feudal order, the system that had kept emperors in power for centuries, and they were determined to dismantle that system.
Oh, wow. So you've got this head-on collision between Confucianism and communism. One emphasizing tradition, the other pushing for a classless society. Not exactly compatible worldviews.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And during the Cultural Revolution, which was from the 1960s to the 70s, Confucianism was officially denounced. Think temples destroyed, texts banned, scholars persecuted. A really dark time for anyone who still held those beliefs.
It's just wild to think about how Confucianism went from being revered to being reviled within a relatively short period of time. Talk about a fall from grace. But here's a question that's been on my mind. If Confucianism was so thoroughly rejected, why are we seeing Confucius statues in temples in China today? Why is there this renewed interest in his teachings, not just in China, but globally?
It's a good question, and it just goes to show you, ideas, they have a way of sticking around even when people try to suppress them or forget about them. And in recent decades, there's definitely been a resurgence of interest in Confucianism, both in China and around the world.
Why do you think that is? What makes his ideas relevant to us now?
I think on a very basic level, people, they recognize the value of those ethical teachings, especially in a world that can feel very ethically ambiguous at times.
Yeah, it's not always so clear-cut, is it?
Not at all. And these values that Confucius talked about, like honesty, respect for elders, self-cultivation, those are pretty timeless, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. They never really go out of style. But do you think it's more than just that?
I think so. I think people are looking for answers, right? We're facing some complex problems. Economic inequality, political polarization, environmental crises. And while some of Confucius's ideas about politics, those might seem a bit outdated to us now, others, like his focus on education, meritocracy, a harmonious society, those resonate really deeply in the 21st century.
It's amazing to think about how, after all this time, Confucius is still making us think, challenging us to examine our values and how we live in the world.
That's the beauty of his work. It's not about giving you a set of rules to follow blindly. It's about asking the right questions. It's about striving to be better people, to create a more ethical and more just world.
What a journey. From humble beginnings to philosophical rock star to being denounced and then rediscovered, it just goes to show ideas, they really do have a life of their own. They evolve, they adapt, they endure across centuries. We've obviously only just scratched the surface here, but hopefully this deep dive into Confucius has given you a new way of thinking about this ancient thinker and the power of his ideas that are still relevant thousands of years later.
Smash that like button.
Please subscribe.
Exactly. We're going to see what makes those effective or not so much.
Thanks for tuning in to History Pod Channel. We hope you enjoyed this dive into history. If you did, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from the past. Your support helps us bring history to life every day. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next episode. What lesser-known historical figures do you think deserve more attention? Get people talking in the comments.
Ooh, I see what you mean. It's not just liking and subscribing, but actually engaging with the topic.
Exactly.
Until next time, stay curious, everyone.